Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So in my study of history, I primarily learn about history from reading books, watching YouTube videos, reading articles online, but every so often throughout my study of history, I love to just read an entire history textbook. Not just a history book, but a textbook that covers something like the entire history of the world, or the entire history of the United States. Just because reading about history as one long narrative, it really allows you to take all these facts you have in your head and synthesize them a little differently. Seeing it as one narrative, you can take all these facts that you already know and think about them a little differently. Just see them as one long story. Because for me, reading a history textbook isn't necessarily about learning new things, even though you're going to learn a ton of information. It's more about just taking what you already know and seeing it as one long narrative, just looking at it differently. Because when you look at things differently, it allows you to find new insights, new takeaways. It just allows you just to reorganize all the thoughts in your head. So over the past couple weeks, I read a textbook. It's not a history textbook per se. It's a textbook about American government, but learning about American government, there's going to be a lot of history involved with that. But what I think made this textbook read very interesting was that this textbook was published in 2015. And the extent of how much has changed since 2015 is staggering. Because I feel like if I read a textbook that was written in 1990 about American government and read it in 2015, it wouldn't be that extreme of a difference. Not that much changed, I don't think, between that time period. But reading a book from 2015 versus today, it's staggering how much has really changed. And that's what I think that's what made this read so interesting. I really think I got a lot of insights this time that, I didn't really get the last time I read this book when I was in college in 2015. But as I read this book, I jotted down a lot of ideas. I had a lot of thoughts. I had a lot of takeaways. Not just things that were in this book, but just ideas, thoughts that were spurred from reading this. So this video is not necessarily a book review per se. I'm going to be talking about this book a little bit, things that I read, just talking about this book as a historical artifact, the fact it was written in 2015, just how much has changed since then. And I feel like reading about history textbook itself, reading a brand new history textbook, it's not necessarily history itself, but it's about history. But eventually the book becomes so old and so outdated that the book itself becomes actual history. So that's, I think, what I'm kind of getting at in this video. Just reading about such an old history textbook just gives you so many insights about how things have changed over the past couple of years. So this book begins, it talks about the founding fathers, the founding of America, the founding of the Constitution. But the main thing that I kind of got from reading this is that democracy is really, you think about law, you think about what's legal, what's illegal. Democracy, not necessarily about what's legal. It's about, democracy itself is an agreement. It's an idea. And an idea is cultivated over time. Because if you look at the Constitution itself, when the Constitution was written, when the Constitution became the legal document that runs this country, the Constitution was illegal at the time because the Articles of Confederation are what ran this country when it first began. So to throw out the Articles of Constitution and adopt the Constitution we have today was an illegal act in itself. So we hear today about a lot of things that Donald Trump is doing that are unconstitutional, which I don't agree with what he's doing, but it's kind of hard to use the argument that what he's doing is illegal because the Constitution itself was illegal. I don't agree with what Trump's doing. I'll get into all that throughout this video, but when you think about what's legal in our country, the Constitution itself was not legal when it was written. So there's a lot of interesting thoughts and discussions you can have based on that. But the main takeaway I got from that is that America is an idea. And that idea is very easy to lose because America decided the Constitution was the right way to govern this country. And it's very easy to lose that. So democracy is something you really have to hold on to because it's very easy to lose it. Another insight I got reading this book, reading about the founding of America, is that I feel that America really represents the embodiment of this idea of individualism, the ideas of the Enlightenment. America really represents the embodiment of that. When the Enlightenment was happening and all these ideas were spreading around the world, America was really the embodiment of that. We were really the first democracy in the sense of the Enlightenment that ever happened in the world. And because of that, Americans really like the idea of freedom, like the idea of individual freedom. And this book makes very clear that a lot of times Americans like the idea of freedom so much that they hold freedom over equality and equity. Threatening your freedom is such an attack on the idea of being an American for so many people. And because of that, this book talks about how, if you look at other countries throughout the world, especially in Europe, there's always this concept of class struggle that's always happening. But in America, we don't really have this idea of class struggle. I mean, obviously there's class divisions in this country, but the main thing that causes division in this country is culture wars. We have these culture wars in America that are far more powerful than class struggle, and it's really just defined America throughout its history. So that's really an interesting thing to think about. Individualism is such an important thing that we don't have class struggle, we have culture wars. Because class struggle is about equality and equity, but culture wars are more about just ideas. I think it's just a very interesting thing to think about. This book talks about how, with democracy in America being an idea, democracy only works when people tolerate the other views of other people. We have the left and the right. So democracy really only works when the left and the right respect each other's ideas. And right now we're really facing a time period where both sides don't tolerate each other. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right, you really don't respect the other side's ideas. And this is a fundamental problem in America. And I think this really represents a dark side of freedom, because freedom, the idea of freedom, allowed slavery to happen, it allowed segregation to happen, it allowed racism to still live on today. So freedom only goes so far. And I feel like every so often throughout American history, you see these sides really clash. That's what you saw during the Civil War. That's what you saw during the Civil Rights Movement. That's what you see again now. Every so often these opposing viewpoints, these opposing sides in the culture wars really come into contact with each other and really clash. And one interesting thing I saw in this book, where it talks about how, I think it was the early 1800s, I think it was like 1805, Thomas Jefferson criticized this newspaper that said something bad about America. And this book talks about how something like that is so outrageous today. And, in 2015, I think that was really the case. But going back to what Jefferson said, when Jefferson said that newspapers were, still a very new concept in America. So it's hard to criticize Jefferson for that, just because newspapers are such a new thing to read about in the media, people criticizing the government. So I think it's hard to criticize Jefferson for that. But what I found interesting is that in this book talks about that concept being outrageous today, which in 2015 that was definitely true. But if you think about Donald Trump today, his attacks on the media, it's just insane to think how far we've come, that Trump has really normalized attacking the media. And that's just a very dangerous place to be at, because this book talks about how having free media, being able to exchange ideas freely is part of a healthy democracy. And the fact that Trump just so openly criticizes people who have opposing viewpoints of him, it just shows that we're not in a healthy democracy anymore. Because, with Jefferson comments, we are still developing democracy. But at this point, we're a very developed democracy. And the fact that we're having issues even more extreme than what Jefferson did just shows how much democracy in America has declined. And this book really goes into detail about how much things have been on this trend of improving throughout American history, and about how things continue to trend. The future seems to be trending in that direction. But I think what's happened since this book was published in 2015, things have not continued to trend in a good direction. Democracy has been threatened in an even greater way than it has in the past. So it's just interesting to see how, I think, naive people were in America about things always being in this state of improving. And I also found it super interesting to read about this section of this book that talks about voter fraud, because this is before 2016, before 2020, before voter fraud became such a central idea in all these conservatives in America. But this book talked about how voter fraud was very common back in the early years of America. It was very common for people to stuff ballot boxes with fake ballots back then. And this book talks about how that's outrageous to think that could happen in America, but that happened in the past. But it talks about how voting has become such a safer thing. There's so much less fraud, and that's true. There is less fraud, but it's just scary to think that people can believe a lie that there is voter fraud today, when it's very evident that things have continued to get better throughout history. Elections are safer. Every time we have an election, it's safer than the previous election. Just reading about how much voter fraud happened back in the 1800s and very, very early 20th century. So I think the authors of this book probably would have never imagined that, voter fraud would have become an issue that we'd be talking about. And nonetheless, voter fraud being not real voter fraud. So it's just scary to see how that's happened. And going back to the ideas of the Founding Fathers really feared a party system. And America is just so embedded with this two-party system that it's just kind of scary seeing how far we come from when this country was founded and all the dangers that the Founding Fathers saw in the party system, and just seeing all those dangers materialize today. But I also think it's really interesting how we have this two-party system, but these two parties we have, their ideas and ideologies have shifted dramatically. The ideas of the Republican Party today are more closely aligned to the Democratic Party in the pre-Civil War era, but these opposing ideologies have shifted, as far as the parties go. And this book also talks about how FDR's presidency was really the defining presidency in this Democrat-Republican shift that we saw in the 20th century. And this book really goes into detail about how the Republican Party was in a state of decline when this book was published, and talking about how this rural-urban divide in America is really changing the political landscape, how a lot of these very liberal strongholds major cities are starting to overtake the very rural parts of America. And it really speculates about how the Republican Party might survive this change. But I think that looking at this book now, looking back at this, I don't think the Republican Party is really going to die in the way that a lot of people thought it would. It's just really going to evolve. Just look at how we have this shift between Democrats and Republicans, what their ideologies are. The American political system is just constantly in a state of evolution. It's constantly changing. And I think if you look at the most recent 2024 election of Donald Trump, you really see how the Republican Party became this working class party. And throughout all different demographics, you see the Republican Party really improved its turnout. So I think that really shows that there's always going to be this two-party system in America, and it's always going to be in this state of evolution. Because this winner-take-all system that we have in this country when it comes to elections, it favors having two parties. But it's going to constantly be changing what these parties represent. And what we have now with Republican and Democrats, what their ideologies are, that's going to change again in another 100 years. But the two-party system our country has really represents, I think, a lot of the divisions that we have in America. And those divisions are starting to get a lot more intense in the past couple of years. And that tends to happen, throughout American history. You had a lot more division right before the Civil War. I feel like we're having a lot more division now. But I think one of the main drivers of that division that we see in America today is social media. Social media really has intensified these political divides that we see in America. And with social media, you're really seeing that opinions outweigh facts. People care much more about what people think than the actual facts. Because if you turn on Fox News or you turn on CNN today, you're going to see nothing but opinions. Both sides, Fox News versus CNN, have very different ideas that they promote, but it's still very based on opinions. You constantly just have people that they're interviewing just getting their opinion. So you can see how much America really values opinion over facts. But as much as I see social media as being a very negative thing, in opinion outweighing facts, I think a lot of these ideas that you see, like fake news and alternative facts, these aren't really new things. Because you look back at the evolution of media, and when you had newspapers, you had this idea, this concept of yellow journalism, where it was just journalism that was very focused on sensationalism. Right before the Spanish-American War, there were a lot of articles in newspapers that weren't necessarily true, but they were just about swaying public opinion to make the public support the Spanish-American War. I think social media today really does the same thing. It's about sensationalism. A lot of these algorithms that social media companies use really promote sensationalism, to promote things that get people mad. And that's what yellow journalism did. And even though yellow journalism was really the first time we saw, this idea of sensationalism in the news on a large scale, I think it's really something that evolved over time, from newspapers to radio to TV to internet, and now with the age of AI, I think you're going to continue to see these ideas of fake news and alternative facts be a very major focus of media. I think one thing that's changed, in this evolution from newspaper to social media is that media has become much more difficult to control, because it's very hard to control social media when it's just random people posting your ideas online. It's harder to control that than when you have just a couple of newspapers publishing articles throughout the country. But regardless of how things evolve in the future, I think that seeing this strong division in America that was amplified by social media really represents the decline of democracy. And getting back to this book talks about how throughout American history, you saw many strong-willed presidents. You saw people like Andrew Jackson, you saw Lincoln, you saw FDR really pushing the boundaries of executive power in America. Because I think if you look at Donald Trump today, how much he's really abusing executive power, I think there's a lot of comparison to be made between him and FDR, because FDR really expanded presidential power in ways that hadn't been done before. I think a lot of our modern America is based off the way the FDR has expanded executive power. And Trump's really just taking all of that to a whole other level that we've never seen before in America. And this book really talks about how when you have a strong-willed president, it's very difficult to stop them. When they have such a very determined mindset to do what they want to do, they're going to find a way to do what they want to do. And it's very hard to stop them. So when you look at a president, you look at who you want to vote for in a president, it's very important to elect a president who respects democracy. Because if you get a strong-willed president who wants to do what they want to do, they're going to do it. They're going to find a way to do it. So you really want to have someone who respects democracy. And Donald Trump is not really someone who respects democracy. So he's really a dangerous president because if he wants to expand presidential power, he'll find a way to do it. So reading about how past presidents expanded presidential power in the ways they wanted to, it's kind of frightening reading about that and thinking about the president that we have in the White House today. But taking a step back from Trump for a moment, if you look at the history of the American government, you can see that the scope of the American government has continued to expand throughout history. It's always growing. Every president that we've had has continued to expand the scope of the American government. And I think because of that, we're eventually going to reach a point where the Constitution is going to be obsolete. The country is going to change so much over the course of its history that eventually the original Constitution is no longer going to hold up. Eventually there's going to have to be changes because you can only amend something so many times before it just becomes obsolete. But as much as I feel like the Constitution will one day be an obsolete document, I think that's still very important to hold on to most of the ideals that our founding fathers had. But what Trump is doing, his disregard for the Constitution, his disregard for the checks and balances in this country, I feel that this is also a symptom of the Constitution eventually becoming obsolete. Because I feel like his disregard for the Constitution is just a symptom of us moving into the post-constitutional era. And before that happens, you're going to see things starting to slowly change. Different presidents having different ideas on what the Constitution represents. As much as I don't agree with Trump, I think that this is a symptom of something much deeper slowly happening in our country. But I think the most dangerous thing that Trump is doing is his attack on the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy really spreads out power. By having all these institutions, all these departments, all these people who are really in the trenches when it comes to running our country, and by having this power spread out between so many people, it's very hard to centralize power under the executive branch. As much as Trump talks about how he wants to lessen this bloated government that we have, at the same time he wants to take away the bureaucracy, take away having a very bloated government. He also wants to centralize power under the presidency. I think these two things are related. If you're talking about getting rid of the bureaucracy, talking about getting rid of all these people who are in the government, you're also talking about centralizing power, because the less people we have in the government, the more the power is going to be centralized. And I feel like that's just inevitable. That's just a symptom of lessening the government. You're going to have a stronger government within one branch. But I think this attack on government that Trump is doing, I feel like this has been a process that's been playing out for a very, very long time. If you look at the Southern strategy around the time of Nixon, where they were trying to appeal to a lot of Southern people by taking all their racist views, but instead of talking about racism, they're talking about lessening the role of the federal government, this idea of law and order, no new taxes, just rhetoric that is about lessening the federal government, because lessening the federal government means lessening regulation when it comes to protecting minorities in our country. And I feel the Southern strategy is really only the very beginning of that, because you look at the Tea Party movement that was going on when this book was published. This book talks a little bit about the Tea Party movement, but it was kind of a dying thing at that point. It really took root during Obama's presidency. But I think the Tea Party movement was really just absorbed by the MAGA movement. It was absorbed by Donald Trump's movement. Because the Tea Party was about going back to America's roots. They really wanted to focus on just the basics of the Constitution, lessening the role of the federal government. And that's really what the ideas that Donald Trump has taken on. So you can see that from the Southern strategy to the Tea Party movement to Donald Trump, it's been this evolution of attacking the broadening scope of the federal government. Because lessening the role of the federal government is really, like I said, about centralizing control of the government under the presidency. But when you look at these ideas that the Tea Party movement had, these ideas that the MAGA movement had, you really have to ask yourself, what is their end goal? What do they want? Why do they want to do all this? And I think the answer is very clear. Because you look at the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement began around the time of Obama's campaign. And Obama really represented a turning point in America. I mean, obviously, there's still issues of racism in this country. Obama was a step in the right direction, but there's still many issues in this country when it comes to race. But I think a lot of the white nationalists in our country really saw the Obama presidency and really were afraid. And that's why we really saw the rise in Tea Party movement, the rise in the MAGA movement, the rise of Donald Trump, because people are afraid of losing power. Because you look at America, America has been dominated by white people throughout all of its history. And that's slowly starting to change. It's in this evolution that's happening over time. But if you look at the year 2020, in the year 2020, the majority of people under the age of 18 were minority people, no longer white people. And by the year 2045, projected that white people will be the minority in America. And that's nothing wrong with that. That's just a natural, evolution of our country. But there's a lot of powers in our country that are very afraid of that happening. People who have power are very afraid of losing power. And I think that's really what Trump represents. He represents the epitome of white America afraid of losing its power. And all these culture wars that we had throughout American history, these culture wars are really at their root about race. And what the Southern strategy was trying to do by using rhetoric to appeal to white racist people in the South, the Trump administration has really taken that to the nth degree. Because instead of talking about policies that directly harm minorities in this country, you're talking about lessening the scope of the federal government, lessening all these programs that help minorities. So you can really see that it's really just this evolution that's continued to evolve, and we're just seeing this moment where it's reaching a point of conflict. Because from the founding of this country up until the Civil War, they were talking about how to deal with slavery. And after the Civil War, up until now, we're talking about how different groups of people can live together. And that's constantly been a point of conflict in our country. And we're just seeing a moment now where that's really getting heated. I think that really has to do with the fact that between the year 2020 and 2045, the demographics of this country are really going to change. And the demographics of who controls power is really going to change. And that's just an environment where I feel like it's very easy to have conflict. I think the main takeaway I had from reading this book, reflecting on the state of American democracy in 2015 versus today, you really see that Trump has just fundamentally changed America. And this tends to happen every 80 years or so in this country. From the foundation of this country, when the Constitution is written, to the Civil War 80 years later, to the era around the Great Depression and World War II, you saw this fundamental shift in the structure of American government. And then 80 years later today, you're seeing that happen again. And the way that Trump is altering this country is just on the scale of World War II, the Civil War, the American Revolution. It's just scary how much he has changed this country in a negative way. And I think that, a lot of these negative things that Trump is doing, I also feel that there's a chance that seeing all these bad things that are happening, it might be a wake-up call for people. And this very bad era we're going through, this era of conflict, could end up leading to a very good place. It could end up making people see the dangers of centralizing power in the executive branch, the dangers of what Trump is doing. So I think that there's a chance that good things could happen after this. Because look at the Civil War. The Civil War was a very traumatic time period for our country, but a lot of good things came out of that. Slavery was ended. I mean, things obviously, there's still issues in our country, after slavery ended. But I think that going through this very chaotic time period could lead to something good happening on the other side. But it's impossible to know. You can't predict history, like I said before. But regardless of that, I think this book really demonstrates that America is going through this period of chaos, this period of extreme change that we see every 80 years or so in the history of this country. But anyway, those are just some random thoughts I had after reading this textbook. But be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.